38. That number appeared in the New York Times on March 27, 1964. 2 weeks after a 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment building in the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens. The headline read, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The body of the article used 38, a copy editor's error reduced it by 1 in the title, and the discrepancy was never reconciled. But the number in either form was the point. 37, 38. A crowd of neighbors who stood at their windows and watched a woman die and did nothing. That number went into psychology textbooks across America and stayed there for 4 decades. It gave a name to a syndrome, the Genovese effect, sometimes Genovese syndrome, that became one of the most cited concepts in the study of human behavior. It was assigned reading in introductory psychology courses in universities from New York to California. It was invoked in op-eds and sermons and congressional hearings as proof of something broken in the American soul in the modern city, in the way strangers had learned to look through one another. There is only one problem with all of that. The number was wrong. The story as told was not true. And the woman whose name was attached to it, whose death was used to illustrate a phenomenon whose murder was turned into a parable, never had the chance to say a word about any of it. This is a story about what happened to Kitty Genovese on a cold March morning in 1964. But it is also a story about what happened to her name in the years that followed. And I have come to think that the second story is in its way as troubling as the first. Before I tell you about the night, I want to tell you about the woman. Kitty Genovese was 28 years old in the spring of 1964. She had grown up in Brooklyn, the oldest of 5 children in a close Italian-American family. Her mother, Rachel, had witnessed a murder on the streets of Brooklyn when Kitty was a teenager. A man stabbed on the sidewalk right in front of her, and the family had moved to Connecticut shortly after, looking for something safer, something quieter. Kitty stayed behind in New York. She was that kind of person. The city suited her in a way that quiet places didn't quite manage. She had worked her way up from secretary to bartender to manager at a bar called Ev's 11th Hour on Jamaica Avenue in Hollis, Queens. She worked double shifts when the owner needed her. She was good at the job in the way that people are good at things they genuinely enjoy. She liked the work, liked the people, liked the particular rhythm of a bar. At the end of a long night, when the last customers finally headed home, she was saving money. She had a plan, an Italian restaurant of her own someday. Somewhere in Queens, somewhere she could put her name on the door. She shared a second-floor apartment on Austin Street in Kew Gardens with a woman named Mary Ann Zilanko, who had been her girlfriend since 1963. They had met in a nightclub in Greenwich Village and had been together for a little over a year when March came around. Mary Ann was 23. Kitty was 28, and by most accounts the more settled of the two, more sure of herself, more at ease in the world. They were by all indications happy, the way young people are happy when they have found something real and are not yet sure how rare it is. Kew Gardens was a decent neighborhood. That matters, and I want to say it plainly, because the story that came later required it to be something else, a symbol of urban coldness, of the anonymity of modern apartment life, of what the city did to people's capacity for care. But Kew Gardens was not a cold place. It was a neighborhood of 6-story apartment buildings and broad sidewalks, and a Long Island Railroad station, and a park, and a movie theater. People knew their neighbors more or less. They were the kind of neighbors you have in a city, not the bone-deep knowing of a small town, but not the blank-faced indifference of a myth either. They were people with jobs and families and ordinary lives who went to bed at a reasonable hour and expected the street outside their building to be more or less safe. On the night of March 12th, going into the early hours of March 13th, Kitty finished her shift at Ev's and drove home in her red Fiat. She parked in the Long Island Railroad station lot on Austin Street, about 100 feet from the entrance to her building. It was around 3:15 in the morning. The street was quiet. She got out of her car and started walking toward her door. She never made it inside. Winston Moseley was 29 years old. He lived in South Ozone Park with his wife and their 3 children. He had no prior criminal record. He worked as a machine operator. On the night of March 12th, while his wife was away on a nursing shift, he got into his car and drove through Queens. He later told investigators he was looking for a woman to kill. He said he preferred women as targets because, in his words, they were easier and didn't fight back. He had killed twice before that night and had not been caught. He saw Kitty in her red Fiat at a traffic light on Hoover Avenue. He followed her to the parking lot on Austin Street and watched her get out of her car. Then he got out of his own car and came after her with a hunting knife. She ran toward her building. He caught her near the street and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed. A light came on in an apartment above. A man named Robert Moser pushed open his window and shouted down at the street, "Leave that girl alone." His voice carried in the quiet air. Moseley looked up, then walked quickly back to his car. Kitty, bleeding, called out that she had been stabbed. She tried to make it to her door. She could not. She made it to the rear of the building to an interior vestibule away from the open street. Moseley sat in his car for about 10 minutes. Then he got out and walked around the back of the building. He found her in the vestibule. He stabbed her again multiple times. He sexually assaulted her while she was dying. Then he left. A neighbor named Carl Ross had seen part of the attack from his window and had called a friend in another building, unsure what to do. The friend told him to call the police. By the time Ross called, it was nearly 3:50 in the morning. A patrol car arrived within 2 minutes. But before the patrol car arrived, another neighbor had already come down. Sophia Farrer was a 70-year-old woman who lived in the building. She heard something and came out of her apartment and found Kitty Genovese lying in the vestibule, badly wounded. She sat down on the floor beside her. She held her. She stayed with her until the ambulance came. Kitty Genovese died on the way to the hospital. I want you to remember Sophia Farrar's name. I want you to hold it alongside the number 38, because when the story of that night was told to the world 2 weeks later, Sophia Farrar was not in it. The woman who sat on a cold floor and held a dying stranger in her arms was not mentioned. Her name appeared nowhere in the article that made this case famous. There was no room for her in the story being told because she was evidence against it. The murder of Kitty Genovese went largely unreported for the first 2 weeks after it happened. It was a crime in Queens, not the first one, not the last. Investigators worked the case. Winston Moseley was arrested 6 days later, caught during an unrelated burglary, and confessed almost immediately. The case from a police standpoint was solved quickly and cleanly. What happened next had nothing to do with the murder itself. It had to do with a lunch. Abe Rosenthal was the new city editor of the New York Times, ambitious, sharp-looking for the kind of story that defined a tenure. In the second week of March, he had lunch with Police Commissioner Michael Murphy. The commissioner mentioned the Genovese case in passing. 38 witnesses, he said. Something to that effect. A remarkable thing. Rosenthal heard a story in that number. He assigned it to a reporter named Martin Gansberg. Gansberg spent 3 days on it, interviewed some neighbors, and filed his piece. The Times ran it on the front page on March 27th. The headline was "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police." The article described in vivid and damning terms a neighborhood that had watched a woman be attacked and killed over the course of half an hour, and had done nothing, had turned away, had gone back to bed, had chosen not to get involved. One unidentified neighbor was quoted saying exactly that, "I didn't want to get involved." The story landed like a stone dropped into still water. The rings went out in every direction and did not stop for 40 years. What Rosenthal and Gansberg had, and what they perhaps could not resist, was a story that explained something people already felt but could not articulate. The cities were changing. The old neighborhoods were shifting. People who had grown up in places where everyone knew, everyone were now living in apartment buildings where they did not know the names of the people directly above them. There was a loneliness to modern urban life that people sensed and worried about, and the story of 38 witnesses who had looked away gave that loneliness a shape, a number, a name. The problem that reporters at a competing paper identified almost immediately, but did not challenge because you did not challenge the Times in 1964, was that the story was built on a number no one had actually counted, describing a behavior no one had actually confirmed in service of a narrative that was compelling, precisely because it could not be easily disproven. 38 witnesses. Where did the number come from? A document in the Queen's DA's office listed interviews with 49 people, some of them pairs or groups interviewed together, miscounted somewhere in the chain between a civil servant and a police commissioner and a newspaper editor. The number shifted, was never verified, and ran anyway. How many of those people actually saw the attack? The DA's office years later said perhaps 6. How many did nothing? The article mentioned none of the people who had shouted from windows, none of the calls that had been made, and nothing at all about the woman sitting on the vestibule floor with Kitty in her arms. A story that needed 38 people to be passive had no use for Sophia Farrar, so Sophia Farrar was left out. In the months and years after, the Times article ran 2 social psychologists named Bibb Latané and John Darley began designing experiments. They were trying to understand why people in groups sometimes failed to help in emergencies, how the presence of other bystanders could paradoxically reduce the likelihood that any individual would act. Their research was careful and rigorous and produced findings that have held up over decades of replication. Diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance, the bystander effect. Their work was real. It described something true about human behavior that had genuine importance for understanding how people act and fail to act in moments of crisis. But it was named after Kitty Genovese. It was named after a version of what happened on Austin Street that the researchers themselves took from the Times unchecked, because the Times was the Times, and in 1964 you did not build a career by questioning their front-page reporting. The founding case study of one of psychology's most influential concepts rested on a news article that the paper of record would eventually call 52 years later, grossly exaggerated. For 4 decades, students in introductory psychology courses across America opened their textbooks to the Genovese case. They read about 38 neighbors watching from their windows. They read about the woman crying for help and no one coming. They learned about diffusion of responsibility through the story of a Queens neighborhood on a March night. And the story they learned was not the story that had actually happened. They learned their lesson about human behavior from a lesson that human behavior had not in fact taught. And through all of it, through the textbooks and the lectures and the op-eds and the decades of citation, there was a woman in Queens named Mary Ann Zielonko, who had been woken by police at 4 in the morning and told that the person she loved was dead, who had then been questioned for 6 hours as a potential suspect, because that was what police did in 1964 when a woman was murdered and another woman had been sleeping in her bed. And after she was cleared, she had to live. She lived through the Times article which did not mention that Kitty had a girlfriend, because that was also not the kind of thing that appeared in the Times in 1964. She lived through the textbooks which did not mention Kitty Genovese as a person at all, only as a case. She lived through decades of strangers invoking the name of the woman she had loved as shorthand for a concept, a syndrome. A thing that had happened in a place called modern life to a woman who was essentially interchangeable with any other victim. She said very little about any of it publicly for a very long time. In 2004, exactly 40 years after the murder, a journalist named Jim Rasenberger wrote a piece for the Times revisiting the case. He found the former Queens Assistant District Attorney, a man named Charles Scholar, who said plainly, "I don't think 38 people witnessed it. I don't know where that came from. We only found half a dozen we could use." In 2007, an article in the American Psychologist went further. 3 researchers, Rachel Manning, Mark Levine, and Alan Collins, reviewed the original evidence and concluded there was no credible support for the claim that 38 witnesses had observed the murder or that they had stood by passively while it unfolded. In 2016, the New York Times published a formal reassessment of its own reporting. The paper acknowledged that the 1964 article had grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. It was the Times concluded a story built more on a powerful narrative than on careful verification. Rosenthal, who went on to become one of the most celebrated editors in the paper's history, defended his decisions until he died in 2006. Gansberg died in 2004, the same year the first major corrections began appearing. Neither of them ever fully reckoned with what had been built on those 2 front pages. The corrections, when they came, were thorough. They were also quiet. They ran inside the paper, not on the front page. They changed the textbooks gradually over years. They did not travel at anywhere near the speed of the original story, which had moved through American culture with the force of something that confirmed what people already suspected, and therefore did not need to be proven. That is the nature of a useful myth. It spreads fast because it answers questions people are already asking. It slows down only when someone takes the trouble to ask a harder question. Not does this explain what I'm feeling, but is this actually true? I think about what it would mean to have your grief turned into evidence. To lose someone you love, to have them taken from you in the worst possible way in the dark, on a street outside the home you shared, and then to wake up 2 weeks later and find that the world has decided what their death means. That a newspaper has run the numbers and drawn the lesson, and the lesson is not about her, not about who she was, or how she lived, or what she was working toward. The lesson is about everyone around her, about the city, about human nature in the abstract, about a syndrome that will carry her name for decades, whether she would have chosen that or not. Mary Ann Zielonko gave one substantive interview on record decades after the murder to a documentary filmmaker named James Solomon, whose brother Bill had spent years trying to recover his sister's story from the myth that had consumed it. In that interview, she said something I have not forgotten. She said that Kitty was her whole life. She said that nothing after had ever quite recovered that quality, that particular brightness, that particular warmth. She said she wanted people to know that Kitty was funny, that she made people feel at ease, that she had a plan for her life and was working toward it. She wanted people to know Kitty was a person, not a number, not a syndrome, not a parable. That seems to me to be the real story here. Not the bystander effect, which is real and important and worth studying, but which did not require Kitty Genovese's name to be real and important. Not the failures of the New York Times, which were serious and consequential and deserving of the eventual corrections. Not even the murder itself, as brutal and senseless as it was. The real story is about what we do with the dead, about how quickly a person's name can be separated from the person and attached instead to the meaning we need them to carry. About the particular loneliness of a story told wrong, told in a way that leaves out the girlfriend, leaves out the neighbor who held her, leaves out the man who shouted from the window, because those details complicated a cleaner, darker, more useful narrative. The bystander effect is real, but Sophia Farrar sat on a cold floor and held Kitty in her arms. That is also real. Both things happened on the same night in the same city. The story that lasted 40 years had room for only one of them. Kitty Genovese is buried in New Canaan, Connecticut, where her family moved after her mother witnessed a murder on a Brooklyn street and decided to find somewhere safer. There is a small memorial plaque in Kew Gardens now near the building on Austin Street. The neighborhood has changed as neighborhoods do. The station parking lot is still there. Winston Moseley died in prison in March 2016 at the age of 81, having served 52 years. He applied for parole 11 times. He was denied 11 times. He spent those decades in prison writing essays about criminal justice reform, giving interviews in which he expressed remorse, participating in college education programs. Whether any of that constituted genuine change, I cannot say. What I know is that he outlived Abe Rosenthal, who died in 2006. He outlived Martin Gansberg. He nearly outlived the myth his crime had generated. Mary Ann Zielonko died in 2024 at the age of 85. She had lived 60 years inside someone else's version of the worst night of her life. In the end, she outlived almost everyone: the killer, the editor, the reporter, the police commissioner who said 38 over a lunch he probably forgot about by the time the bill came. The number 38 is no longer in most psychology textbooks. The bystander effect is still there, still important, still worth teaching. It just travels now under different examples, different case studies. The Genovese case is cited as a caution about the dangers of accepting compelling stories without verifying them, about how easily a number can outrun the facts it was supposed to represent. That is something I suppose, what I keep coming back to after everything is simpler than any of it. A young woman worked double shifts and saved her money and had a plan and loved someone and came home at 3 in the morning on a Friday and was followed from a parking lot. A neighbor held her at the end. She died on the way to the hospital. That is the whole of it. That is what actually happened. She deserved to have that story told straight, not enlarged into a parable, not stripped of the people who loved her or the people who helped her, not handed over to a concept that needed a name and found hers convenient. The 38 people who didn't call the police, most of them were never there. The woman who was there, who sat on the floor and held her, was left out of the story for 60 years. I don't know what that says about the city, or about human nature, or about the bystander effect. But I think I know what it says about stories. About how much damage a useful story can do when it moves faster than the truth. About how long it takes for a correction to travel the same distance a myth already has. And about what we owe the people whose names we borrow, whose deaths we explain, whose lives we reduce to the size of a lesson. We owe them at the very least the truth of what happened. Even if the truth is quieter, even if it is less useful, even if it does not confirm what we already suspected about ourselves. Even then,